Figuring out which color goes where in your image, in your illustration, is, I think, one of the fundamental challenges for an artist. Harder still is knowing how much of each color to put where. What are the basic proportions of color that you should have in an image? This is something that concerns both illustration, comic books, and also cinema. Basically, any type of situation where you're trying to create an image, where you're trying to entertain the eye. You see, the thing is that balance and proportion are fundamental building blocks of making pictures, but it's not always balance as in 50-50. Balance when it comes to composition and art is often more complicated. When it comes to composition, we can actually balance something very big with something very small. We can balance an area of intense detail with an area of intense rest where there is no detail. And likewise with color, we can often balance a very intense amount of color with a lot of not much color at all, a lot of neutrals. And I think this idea of understanding color proportion is really essential to understanding how to engage visual hierarchy and really get your 1, 2, 3 read right. Now, that's all well and good, but this stuff can veer into Zen poetry or something like a haiku, where we're kind of saying that balance is about not having balance. The real question is, what do you actually do? And as artists, how do we simply turn this into a visual language, an easy way for us to understand proportion when it comes to color and composition and how to lead the eye? In this video, I want to dig into this topic and look at how we can simply visualize proportions of color with an image using a pyramid, or essentially a triangle of colors, and that this will give us a really good idea and an easy way to understand proportion of color in images that we see in the world, and how we can use that to help us both plan images that have good color proportion and also to adjust images as we're going to make sure that we have good visual hierarchy, to make sure that our viewer's eye knows where to go. As usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. I'm just going to show you some images in Photoshop, some that I've created, some that other people have created from different mediums, and I'm going to try and share with you how I think this concept works, and then we'll look at some basic simple takeaways to see if you can direct that and really use it in your own work. I think that when I really started to understand this, it gave me a lot more freedom, and I think that's often what you need when you're trying to deal with all the complexities of creating an image. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. All right, before we jump in, I do want to preface this by saying that what I'm going to talk about here with this kind of pyramid of color, it's often been sort of called a layer cake of color. I think this is one of these fundamental ideas that's really, really useful to kind of get your head around how color and tone and a lot of other things are actually utilized within an image. I think there's often a lot of counterintuitive things that happen that thinking about this can really, really help. But it is important to understand that in terms of thinking about this as a rule or what you should or shouldn't do, this really is just mapping out some good ideas and some explanations of what kind of has worked. And the real goal here, I think, is that if you can kind of get a good baseline for understanding how to use color, color proportion, color schemes to really kind of make an image work, direct your viewer's eye and get your 1, 2, 3 read, your visual hierarchy sort of sorted. Again, I'll explain a little bit of what those basic concepts mean because I think it's important. Once you kind of get this sorted, it's much easier to kind of use that as a launch pad to then kind of, you know, drift into the infinity of possibilities that is art. And I think it's important to look at it this way. Again, this is just a really good way to kind of get started. And also for me, the other way that I tend to use these kind of ideas is if I'm a bit lost, this is always a really good way to kind of pull me in. And I've actually found I've used these ideas quite a bit, quite blatantly, especially when, you know, I'm on deadline. You know, I'm creating a concept illustration for a video game, and often, you know, we don't have time to really think about, you know, what is the ultimate artistry involved here. We often just need, again, simple plans that work, simple things where you can take, again, a simple image, a simple concept art piece, but you can try and raise it a little bit above just kind of being something that explains a concept in a game. And again, give it a little bit of extra something. So that's often how I found these ideas to be really useful, is taking a lot of ideas from illustration and cinema and trying to kind of find where's that through line. How do we really think about and go deep on what are the fundamentals of picture making? But as I said, these are just guides. These are just maps of things that have worked. And the goal here is to kind of get you on a good even footing so that you can start to understand the world, increase your visual literacy, and then take it to the next level. Again, not all artists are going to perfectly follow these kind of things, but you tend to find that these things do work. All right, so let's look at how the basics of this concept function. Now, I've got a couple of examples here that we'll sort of go over and sort of look at how this will apply to some images I've created and some images from cinema, because I think that's a good counterpoint. And after we've sort of done that, I'll look at also how we can see this idea of balance manifest in a lot of good books on illustration and composition. So we'll look at Andrew Loomis's Creative Illustration and Edgar Payne's Composition of Outdoor Painting, which are classic sort of tomes on composition, and look at how this idea of balance, I think, plays out there. But firstly, let's just look at, okay, how are we actually understanding this? Like, what is actually going on here? So I think the fundamental insight, like the TLDR, if you only take this away from this entire video, is that the majority of an image is often these kind of muddy, neutral, gray colors. And that's not, again, not always the case. As I sort of mentioned in the preface, there are often exceptions to these things, and there's interesting ways with imagery we can create balance. But often what you will see, if we define the color within an image in this kind of pyramid, is that often the bottom of the pyramid, these sort of bottom layers, are really made up often of these kind of neutral, nothing grays. So we have these sort of, relatively speaking, much less saturated colors. We've obviously got this big block of the yellow combi van, and we've also got some of this more saturated green, right? And again, there are a couple of little pops here of very sort of saturated, much more fluoro green, right? So you're seeing this kind of, again, this sort of layering of colors and this proportion of color. And while, like, yes, there are some really good sort of accents of color that are more in that sort of red frame, really the accent that is working quite well here is the white. And the white is a void of color, but that's actually a really good way compositionally to create balance in an image where there's a lot of color. So this is a lot more colorful in general. So the mud colors down the bottom, these sort of neutrals, are going to be a lot more sort of brighter and sort of vibrant than others would be. But again, often the bottom of the image, the majority of what's actually there is what we sort of term as these neutrals, these kind of gray tones, or again, often they're sort of referred to as mud. And the reason for that is often when you are kind of painting traditionally, which I don't do a lot of, you often, if you're painting a lot of these grays, you're going to sort of see that they are going to be these kind of muddy colors that don't have a lot of vibrancy, and they're all going to sort of blend into each other. And if you were to see this on a palette, right, if you're painting in oils or watercolor or something, right, often these are this kind of muddy color, right? This is where a bunch of colors get mixed together. Things become less distinct. These are not pure colors, and they kind of blend into each other. You get more neutrals, more grays, and that's actually often the majority of what an image is. We don't often notice that, though, because our eye is drawn to the things with color. And it's important to understand that as a viewer, you often experience mostly these accents. So here we've got, yeah, there's a couple of like very sort of vibrant colors here, right? We've got these, as I said, these sort of bright reds that I think are helping to sort of draw the eye, but they're kind of spattered around the place, and really functionally they're doing a better job of increasing the vibrancy through color vibration of the greens, because again, red is a good complement of green. The thing that's really helping me to draw the viewer's eye is this white. And the white is a void of color, which, as I said, is a good way to, if you have a colorful image, to create contrast, right? Because again, I could try and make this more saturated. I can try and make his clothing red to really try and draw the eye, but making it white creates this nice little sort of accent at the top of the pyramid that is often where our sort of eye is meant to go. So this is a good way to think about it, right? You can think about the Illuminati style eye at the top of the pyramid, right? That's kind of where we want our eye to go, right? You know, the rest of it is there to support that. So one of the fundamental keys to understand is that often when we're trying to draw the eye, it's a matter of understanding that sort of more is often less, right? So in order to get a lot more focus where we want, we often have to put less everywhere else. So let's see how that sort of plays out, right? So here I've got this image here, and you can see that, as I was saying, like a lot of this pyramid at the bottom is kind of made up of these kind of nothing colors, right? These kind of unremarkable, but, you know, sort of pleasant to look at sort of greens. And this is a real sort of homogeneous series of colors, right? These are unoffensive. They kind of blend into each other, right? It kind of works pretty well, you know, and I've sort of got some, you know, these get a little bit redder. Again, I'm often putting little sort of accents in here, right? You sort of see there's some nice little sort of red tones here and there to kind of draw out and create interest. So there's this idea of sort of creating interest and vibrancy by having some colors vibrate with others. But where you really see the most sort of contrast in this frame, again, from my perspective, is where eye is kind of drawn to this guy here, and that's done through having some reds. So right at the top, we sort of got some reds. We got, again, some of these kind of whites of the hair, right? We got this of sort of the face, and basically, you know, pretty much everything else is, you know, these types of colors that are, you know, not that interesting. And I think this is really, you know, sort of worth looking at and understanding. Again, there's not a lot of rhyme or reason in terms of, you know, what color I'm sort of putting where. On the pyramid, I'm really just thinking about, like, you know, which is the most sort of prominent and which ones are really the accents that are close to where we're sort of drawing the eye. And often it is this balance that allows our eye to go to a particular area. And it is the lack of the colors and the contrast and the vibrancy that you would see elsewhere that actually supports that. And again, these ideas are fundamental to balance and composition, so we could also perceive this as being related to things like tonality or detail levels, etc., right? There is a hierarchy to that. But in terms of color, I think this is a really simple way to look at it. So let's before we do this one and this one, let's go look at sort of some cinema and see, well, how's this idea used in other mediums? And here you can see, obviously, we got a very similar idea. If you kind of look at a lot of these sort of frames here from Blade Runner, you can see that most of it is this kind of black, which again is a lot of what you see in much of sort of film is sort of darkness or a lack of light. Here, same sort of thing. We've got this sort of green background, these dark colors that are making up a lot of it, and it's this green mixed with this real sort of warm fleshy color. And that's, you know, it is this hierarchy of understanding what is actually going to be there and what are you mostly seeing. So here again, we've got a lot of sort of darkness. Most of the image is going to be made up of darks, dark blues, and some dark sort of purpley sort of skin tones. But then we do have this nice neon lighting here, right? Which really does kind of create that sort of vibrancy. And even though, again, you know, a lot of this image is working sort of tonally, not via color, it's important to understand that, if we didn't have that vibrancy there, the image may feel really dead, right? It may feel as if it doesn't have anything interesting. Similarly, if we look at this image from Ridley Scott's original Alien, you can see that, most of this image is these kind of blacks and grays, right? So if we just sort of break that down, right, a lot of it is going to be just really boring sort of blacks, right? We got these kind of gray tones, right? And then the things that are going to sort of pop out are going to be, obviously the skin tone is a little bit different, right? But really the thing that's popping are these kind of highlights. And again, this is a much more tonal image, so you're going to see this represented in terms of the variety of color, the vibrancy of color, etc., right? So here we're seeing, again, that sort of real highlight and the way that these different sort of colors interact. And yeah, even though that's a lot sort of lighter, again, it's still in this sort of mushy grayness, right? So again, you're seeing a lot of black, a lot of these kind of mushy, cool grays. We're seeing some sort of vibrancy in the skin tones, but you can see on a value level, again, these are all kind of muddy, right? They're all kind of blending into each other. There's some cool, warm, cool vibrancy, right? But really, if you kind of go and look at it, right, this is all sort of this muddy nothing. And there's not a lot of color vibrancy in there at all. Again, if we sort of look at this one as a counterpoint, you're going to see a lot of these, right, sort of whites, grays, right? Again, a lot of this image is this kind of white color. And, then we have a couple of these little sort of accents, right, where we really see the face kind of pop. And then obviously there are also, a couple of these little sort of accent colors around the place, right, that, sort of make it a little bit more sort of interesting. And again, this is not a scientific dissertation on exactly what proportion of colors are there or anything like that, but it's just to kind of understand, again, if you sort of look at all of these, again, not from what you're saying, is like there's a lot of similarity with, a large proportion of the image, and then you're looking at these kind of accents of different color. Again, same with this, the accents are going to be these rim lights, and probably if you sort of contrast, a lot of this kind of skin tone with maybe, right, some of this sort of pinker skin tone here. But yeah, mostly what we're looking for is that kind of little accent. And this is a big part of how images are constructed. Same thing you can see here. Again, this one's an interesting sort of style of image, right? It's very stylized. It feels very stylized. With this one, though, again, you're seeing a similar idea. Mostly, we're going to see a giant chunk of these kind of gray, sepia tones, right? We obviously have the blues, right? We got the skin tone, and then obviously we've got this sort of accent of the sort of hats. But again, it's so important to understand that what we see as the hat as a viewer, and as an artist, we often don't put enough effort into building the structure of these backgrounds and really pushing them back and letting the sort of number one read that we want people to see really sort of pop forward. So again, just going back to these, again, you can see a sort of similar idea here, right? If we sort of try and break that down, mostly what you're seeing are these very dark kind of colors here, boom. And we are sort of building up to some sort of lighter colors around the place. But mostly what you're seeing, right, the vast majority of the image is, right, this kind of gray muck, right, that you kind of can't really tell the difference between most of those colors. But, at the top, we do see, right, these kind of real sort of warm colors. And it is often this that, right, is allowing us to sort of really focus where, like here, on this character. And again, the basic idea is going to follow here as well. There are some good sort of different examples of this. So we'll just sort of quickly look at another example here. So this is a comic book page that I did. And with this one, you can see, obviously, there's a lot of vibrant color. So it's not necessarily saying that the accent color has to be a vibrant color. I think often it is. But as you have seen, it can also be like in an image that has a dominant contrast of value, it has less color contrast. Again, if you haven't checked that out on the Drawing Codex YouTube channel, there's a great sort of series of videos I did recently talking about the difference between color and tonal contrast as a way to sort of organize your images. This is a very sort of similar idea here. But when you have this, again, the accent color is probably this kind of yellow, right? Or the little sort of purple. So you're going to get a very sort of different look there, right? Most of the image is going to be this kind of color. All right, boom. It's going to be this kind of color. It's going to be like a lot of it is red. Like heaps of this image is just red. There are a lot of these kind of neutral tones here and there, right? But yeah, a huge amount of it is just red. That's like mostly what it is. But we got a bit of this sort of purple up here, and then obviously there's this kind of yellow at the top, right? So again, you can have a huge proportion of your image to be very colorful. And again, as long as that's sort of what you're after, it's just like, whoa, a lot of color. It's meant to be a little bit overwhelming. That can work sort of fine too. Again, if I did have some real white or lack of color here, or real black, that may also be a great way to kind of separate that out. But yeah, again, anyway, that's like another sort of good example there. Let me see if I can copy that out. Now we can sort of look at this one. So this image here is a little bit interesting because it sort of has a large proportion of this kind of dark sort of blue color, but we do get quite blue, and then a large portion of it is actually also quite contrasty in terms of color. So it has this real warm, cool yellow blue complementary color scheme going on. There's also quite a bit of sort of purple in there, but again, you can kind of clearly see right at the top we got some of these sort of accents here. All right, got that sort of tongue there that's also quite bright. And yeah, you're seeing this sort of interesting, right, sort of contrast there between these different colors, right? So again, most of it is this kind of warm, cool contrast, but then we also come in with the red and really kind of still give it that sort of big accent. So again, that hopefully gives you a good idea of how we can visualize as artists. And I think this is so important, is that as artists, we need a visual, easy way to understand this. And this is not scientific in any way. There's probably ways we could sort of break down and actually analyze, like, hey, how much color is actually in each image? I'm really doing this by eye, and again, I'm mostly trying to pick images that do a good job of explaining this. But I think if you actually start studying, you see a lot of really good imagery does break down this way. So next, let's look at some sort of classic examples of where you might see this idea of balance and these concepts of composition in sort of traditional books on picture making. So here we got some good examples from some seminal tomes of picture making, creative illustration, and Edgar Payne's composition of outdoor painting. And I think what you'll sort of notice is probably if you look at these artists' work, you see many of these concepts of color proportion working, and often they're actually explaining it also in terms of balancing different types of elements of the picture, like busy, areas of rest, dark and light, etc. But again, this is really just a matter of understanding that this idea of balance and proportion within the image is key, again, at a very sort of high level. And if you look at Edgar Payne's actual paintings, you'll see a lot of this stuff working really, really well. And again, so often it is a matter of having, sort of here, we sort of look again, it's always a matter of having some little sort of accent, really sort of draw your eye, making sure that's your primary read. Now, I did sort of talk about this idea of 1, 2, 3 read, and I've had some comments, people saying like, what are you talking about, 1, 2, 3 read? The first read is really just the thing that your eye is drawn to first. The second is, again, the secondary read, right? Like, what is the thing that your eye will look at next? And then the tertiary read, the third read, is what's all the other stuff, right? So typically what we're after is having these areas of focus so that your eye is able to move around an image and have sort of somewhere to go that's relatively clear. And again, there's so many different ways to kind of organize it, but I think if you just sort of look at a lot of good compositional literature, you'll see this idea of balance really being a major component. Here you can see in creative illustration, Andrew Loomis is doing a really good job of describing this, talking about how the balance can be on a compositional level, where he's sort of saying, that the heavier the object is or the larger it is, the sort of more you can sort of balance it by putting it towards the middle of the frame. And that you can also balance things by, again, sort of putting the smallest thing nearest the frame, or the heaviest can be the nearest. But again, playing with this idea of sort of balance in foreground, background, big, small, etc. And I think it's just important to understand, again, these ideas are very important and, often talked about when it comes to illustration. And I think if you often look at a lot of Andrew Loomis's sort of examples, you often see these ideas as sort of one thing balanced against another. And if you just kind of think about that sort of contrast being just inherently something that is interesting, and you just see that really good composition and good illustration is often talking about color contrast, value contrast, big, small contrast, negative space contrast, and that's really mostly what's going on. So balancing it, I think, is a little bit sort of mystical. It's not always quite so mathematical, but hopefully you can see how these ideas of color proportion are very much going to relate to a lot of the other stuff you might learn when it comes to illustration and picture making theory. Okay, so how do you actually utilize these ideas? I think there's two fundamental things that we can obviously do. We can plan to include these concepts, but we can also use these ideas as we adjust our image. Now, I think in all cases, often what we're trying to do is draw the eye to a particular area. And this goes back to this concept of hierarchy and refining our 1, 2, 3 read. Now, again, I'll dig into this a little bit sort of as we progress through this video, but really when you're thinking about planning your image, it's mostly a matter of understanding the basics that a lot of your image is probably going to be these neutral tones, and that's fine. Often in the beginning, what we're trying to do is add more. We often feel like an image is lacking contrast, that it's hard to actually see where we should look at it. And this is why this concept of thinking about where is your accent, like where are your accent colors, where are you really getting people to look, is so important, because often we need to start there and work our way backwards. In the beginning, it's really easy to fall into the trap of saying, I need to add more. We look at the areas that we want focus in, and we're often trying to add more detail, more contrast, more color, and you keep turning those things up, and then you just got too much of everything. And I think often people don't really look at the proportion of color, the proportion of vibrancy, and the way that the images that they are really admiring are actually constructed. And it's only when you get out your color eyedropper, you look at what all those colors are in Photoshop or some other sort of image editing program, and you understand mostly what you're doing is applying these colors that aren't actually that vibrant. And I think the more experienced hand, the more experienced artist is more likely to say, okay, I want this area of the image to really sing. I want people's eyes to be drawn here because that's part of the compositional flow. This is often what we're trying to do when we think about our primary read. What's the first thing that you look at? Often, the way you do that is not by putting more there, it's by putting less elsewhere and really sort of toning back the background, pushing the background back. And I think this is often a real trick, is if you plan these things in the beginning, just with a color rough, a color thumbnail, I think this actually gives you something to do when you're thinking about your color thumbnail, something that is less just you putting colors down there. Because I think one of the real uses for a color thumbnail is to think exactly about this stuff. What is the proportion of color there? Where are my vibrant colors? Where's all my sort of muddy colors? And is this whole thing going to work? I think you can also start to assess images that you really like and maybe break them down in terms of, okay, like what actually is the proportion of color in the images and the styles that you really enjoy. You may find some of them use mostly, there's a lot of muddy nothing. and that's often a really successful images that we often really like have this quality where a lot of it's just sort of these pastel tones or these gray tones, this mud. You might find, though, that a lot of it is very vibrant, like some of the sort of comic book pages I showed, where it's all fluoro red. And that's the actual, mostly the proportion of color that you're working with. Again, it's all a matter of proportion and relativity. And this is where hierarchy is so important. It's less a matter of, is this very bright or is this dark? It's a matter of, is it bright or dark relative in hierarchy to the other things within your image? So really just look at the images you like, look at the proportions that are there, and then when you're planning your image, this is where you can really find utility to doing your color off. It's easy to skip a color off and say, I'll kind of figure it out, or like, that seems like too much work. But when you have a real idea of what you should be doing, which is like, okay, what's the number one read? Where should I be looking? How am I going to use color to actually help that? And how is my image organized? I think that's where, again, when you're planning, you can really try and, you could literally look at color schemes you kind of like and, make a little color pyramid, or just think about what is the color scheme going to be and use one of these little pyramids to kind of think about it or just visualize it. But this gives you something to actually think about as you're doing that color thumbnail. So planning and thinking about color proportion, I think, is really, really useful. The other thing that we can often do is, as we're working on an image, as I said, you're often trying to add more to a particular area. We're trying to shift around the focus to make sure that what we want is really drawing the eye. And this can be a matter of just stepping back and assessing your image and looking and going, okay, what have I got here? Do I need to tone down a lot of these other colors in the background? How do I create that visual hierarchy? And how might I expect these things to sort of end up? And I think this is often where, if you look at the image you've got and kind of say, okay, like, what is the proportion here? Does this feel balanced? Does this feel like the kind of proportion of color that are in images that I actually like? Do I need more vibrancy, less vibrancy? What is actually going to make things work? Because when you're staring at an image and it's all fluoro red or all fluoro green, or more importantly, often this was a massive problem for me early on, is I'd be looking at my image, it's all kind of mushy gray. But when you're in the dark at 3 a.m. and you're just kind of starting to figure this stuff out, your eyes get wide and you almost have this kind of night vision thing where you can see this symphony of colors in the sort of mushy painting that you're creating. You're seeing the vibrancy of all those gray tones, and it seems very interesting. And then I'd wake up in the morning, I'd look at it and be like, that's just a gray mess, I can't see anything. So often it's really good to step back and actually get the eyedropper out and look at, okay, what have I got here? Do I have an accent color? Is it significantly different? How am I going to pull focus? And what does that proportion actually look like? And I think also you can just have some very simple rules here that can act as sort of bumpers for you, to make sure you don't sort of get too far off into, sort of things that probably aren't going to work here, especially in the beginning. And just maybe have some basic proportions that function and sort of say, okay, you might want to have, 70% of the image is just kind of these sort of muddy grays or is just kind of one color. And then maybe 20% of it is, some sort of complementary color to that. And then that last 10% is your sort of accent color, etc. And maybe again, the last 1% is just an extra vibrant version of that sort of accent color. So again, there's some very simple proportions that you can use. And I think, as opposed to maybe me saying, hey, this is the rule that you should use, really go look at images that you like and see if you can derive that, because I think that'll get you much closer to creating the art that you actually want. Okay, so if we just jump back into Photoshop, one of the key things here that I think is so important to take away from this is when it comes to proportion, often we are after balance. And a lot of balance is a matter of balancing our 1, 2, 3 read, our visual hierarchy. So I just want to sort of go through and make that as sort of clear as possible so that we really understand what those words mean, because I think that can be easy to miss. So when it comes to visual hierarchy or our 1, 2, 3 read, what you're really looking at is when you look at an image, what's the number one thing you kind of go to? And again, this is not necessarily always 100% the same for everyone. Everyone's going to experience your image in their own way. And when people actually do eye tracking on this, it's a little bit more messy, right? People's eyes bounce around. They do a whole bunch of weird stuff. But I think this is a good principle to think about because it will give your image some structure. And it's often really structure that we're after. Some kind of sense of purpose to the image is really good. So again, if we sort of look at this one, you can see that obviously there are some really sort of different ways that I'm sort of creating contrast. Now, your sort of primary read could be sort of this character. It could also be here, right? I have a lot of value contrast between this character's head and the sort of sky behind them. And so normally what you're going to see, is sort of this or this, and our eye is going to sort of alternate between sort of looking at these. And obviously I've been able to use the value contrast and the silhouette to really pop this character out. But back here, I've had to use a lot more of this color proportion and these sort of accent colors. And you can see that this red, even though it's very toned down, and this is where hierarchy and 1, 2, 3 read is so important, is that even though if we actually eyedrop this red, you can see it's not that vibrant, right? There's not really any vibrant colors in this whole image. It's very toned down, very subtle, but there's nothing else in this whole image that is as vibrant as this character's face and this character's little sort of cloak thing. So that really is the way to understand it, right? Again, there is a lot of these sort of greens, but none of them are that saturated, and everything is green. And so even though the greens are a little bit saturated, they just kind of blend into this sort of green mush, right? Everything's green, and so nothing's green. We don't really perceive the greens that much. But when we had a little bit of red, even though the red is very toned down, because there's only a little bit of it, there's a lot of contrast because of that balance, and thus we get a good sort of either primary or secondary read on this character. So again, our eye knows to sort of go here, it knows to go here. And again, the tertiary stuff, right, the third degree stuff is probably sort of everything else where you can sort of bounce around, but your eye is probably going to be sort of drawn back towards a lot of these different areas. And again, a lot of the lines within the composition obviously sort of facilitate that, right, facilitate movement back to those areas. But again, it's easy because that visual hierarchy is there. In a similar way, if we sort of look at this image, you can notice that, again, we're probably going to have two main points of focus. We're going to have this character, and more specifically, right, this sort of part of the character, because that's where we have the most value contrast, but also the color proportion here, where the only thing that we see that has these kind of colors in it, again, even though they're not going to be that vibrant, that figure there, the character is the only thing that has those kind of warm tones, so they really sort of pop out. And this character, although it has a lot of contrast, seems to sort of blend into the background a lot more. So I guess the real thing here is that there's a lot of subtlety to the way you can sort of manage this, as I sort of hinted at in the preface. But if we just sort of think about using and understanding color proportion, this will allow you to sort of organize your images quite well. And this is something that I often use when I'm trying to make something really sort of pop. So I think with this image, probably one of the things that was happening is that, the actual character on the top really wasn't popping enough. And I actually think probably at the end, the thing that I did to really sort of make this image have a little bit more drama, as I was sort of mentioning, because it is a concept piece, is I just sort of upped the color vibrancy on this. And even though I had good color vibrancy in the background to the foreground, I had this interesting sort of interplay there. This really becomes much more illustrative when we sort of add this sort of red tone there. And, that's just one of these fundamental things that, when you're looking for, okay, how do I make this sort of pop, right? How do I make this feel like it's a little bit extra? It was just a little sort of overlay of red there that sort of lifted this one up. So the last thing I'd say is that fundamentally here, what we're talking about is proportion and balance. And this is a little bit tricksy. There is an art to this, and a lot of the simplicity that we might see here that's very functional, that will allow you to kind of, again, build a good springboard to really get to the next level with your color theory and just building illustrations. This idea of there being proportion overall to the image is a very simplistic frame, but I think it's extremely useful. But just understand that you can have a very interesting mud, right? Often I'm saying that a lot of this image is just kind of these grays, but often the trick of good art is to make those grays very interesting by playing up the warm and cool contrasts, but within the grays. and to play different grays off each other. There's a lot of magic in this nothing, and often really good images don't just have 70% of gray, right? It's 70% of really, really interesting gray. And that's often where, we really have to skill up. So it's not a matter of saying that the majority of the image is sort of boring and it's nothing. In order to really make an image that you can live in, that you can look at, and there's so much stuff there, you need to both make a lot of that nothing really interesting, but also give people somewhere to look so that their eye is drawn around. And again, this is why it's, a real art to do this well. So you'll see that, not everyone's grays are exactly equal. Some people are really good at this, and you can have very vibrant little sort of areas of color contrast, different patterns. And this is often where sort of texture and subtlety and different ways of kind of creating color vibrancy can really sort of help you. But at its core, I think breaking down images this way, making that sort of color pyramid, thinking about the fundamental proportions, understanding that often the way forward is a matter of hierarchy, or finding a 1, 2, 3 read, or building that very much into your initial thumbnail, that will actually get you off the ground. That will get you started. And it's a great way to think about and understand color theory and look at how these things are actually applied. It's one thing to just say, let's use complementary colors, but it's tricky to figure out how to actually employ that and make that into an image that works and has the right feeling that you want. Now, if you do want to take your grays to the next level and make that sort of mud really interesting, one of the best ways to do it is, as I said, through warm, cool contrast, by playing up the contrast between warm and cool within that sort of mush of gray, having slightly warmer grays, slightly cooler grays. And if you haven't already, check out this video because I give you some great tips on how exactly that works and how you can do that in your own work.